It's 11 a.m. and you have joined this phase 3 webinar on how to navigate the HR tech landscape. We're just going to give people about 30 seconds or 1 minute or so to join us, and then we'll make a start on our content. If you would like to scan the QR code that appears on your screen, then you can do so now, and that will take you straight through to the phase 3 website. So we'll just give people a bit more chance to join. Okay, I think we're ready. I can see the numbers going up, so let's make a start. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this phase 3 webinar on how to navigate the HR technology market. My name is Louise Johnston, and I am the Head of Customer Success here at phase 3, and I'll be hosting this webinar / fireside chat this morning. So today we're going to look at the challenges in system selection. We'll go through the common hurdles and how to overcome these in a landscape that is constantly changing. So with the right approach, a system selection project should be relatively straightforward, but every project is different. So we're going to go through what a system selection project should look like, from the selection process through to working with vendors, right through to managing a project team, managing budgets, setting timelines, and then of course the role of consultancy. To set the scene a little bit more, here at phase 3, our ultimate goal is to make sure that you have the right technology for your organization, your people, and your HR department as well. So you're not just looking at tech for yourself. It is, of course, a much bigger project than that. As I said earlier, every system project is as unique as you and your organization. So our tailored approach is here to help you, and our team will always be the ones to bridge the gap between HR people and their technology. So I'm your host for this morning. As I say, my name is Louise, and I've worked in the HR and payroll industry for 15 years, and that was prior to my career here at phase 3. So before then, I wasn't technical at all. So I understand how difficult these projects can be and how daunting they are. But luckily, I'm joined by two people who are much more technical than myself, both Malk and Matt, and they are well versed in the industry, and the purpose of this session is for us to share our knowledge with you. There'll of course be an opportunity for you to ask any questions at the end in the chat box. So let's make a start and go into some introductions. Malk, would you like to go first?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining the webinar. I'm Head of Sales at phase 3 and been in position just over 12 months now. Like Louise, I've had 14, 15 years of experience in the technology market, both working for vendors and consultancies across HR, payroll, pensions, finance, ERP. At some point, I've either worked for one of the vendors, a competitor, or been in partnership with most of the mid-market products that you'll be familiar with. So well placed to really guide some of you guys on this call in some of the trials and tribulations of system selection.
Thanks, Malk. Matt.
Hi, I'm Matt Ram. I've been at phase 3 for about 5 years. Most recently, my post is the lead system selection consultant, so helping organisations go to market and source new software. Prior to that, I've worked in HR for nearly 10 years now in some capacity, whether that was as a HR admin, studying maths CIPD qualification, or I also worked in recruitment as well. So hopefully have a decent amount of experience to be able to help you on your way today.
Great. Thanks, Matt. So to start with, let's go to Malk. With the amount of experience that you've got in this industry, do you want to start at high level? Tell us about the challenges that you've come across and that you've seen over the years.
Before I go into that, I think it's important to perhaps look at, is system selection even needed? A lot of customers that perhaps are on this call would believe they need to embark on a system selection journey and perhaps haven't had some kind of consideration around some of the elements that would lead you to even validate whether system selection is even needed in the first place. So, have the customer applied the latest release to their software? Have they got the correct configuration for their business? Have they got all the modules applied for the software that are required for the business? Is there any third-party software even that might complement what they currently have for them to get to a place of utopia versus changing out a whole system? Equally, people are important. So, training, has talent and knowledge left the business, and has training been kept up to date with? And why was that system selected in the first place? All that cost, time and disruption, is that really needed to change systems if you can actually fix what you've got? So for me, before we go into any of the challenges around system selection, I think it's really important to spend a huge amount of time considering, is actually what you've got fit for purpose if it was done the right way? Moving into system selection journey for those customers that have validated that actually the system isn't fit for purpose. And you could determine that through a health check using a consultancy like Phase 3. You've got to really consider clients really having the time to commit to this, the resources, and having the knowledge of vendors and knowledge of art of the possible, given that technology is changing so fast. Really understanding industry best practice and world-class benchmarking, general awareness and appreciation of the time and budget that's involved in a project like this. Special consideration around things like data migration, system integration, change management, and digital adoption and transformation. Otherwise, all the efficiencies that you're expecting are not going to be gained, and the investment then just becomes pointless.
And I think that's a really good point, Malk. Taking that step back before you even embark on this, because we do hear quite a lot in our roles at Phase 3, the system just isn't working. I need something new. But it's important to look at what you've already got because, of course, it is such a huge project. You touched on a couple of things there, which would be interesting to dig a little bit deeper on. So you've mentioned time and resource. What are the main challenges around time and resource, do you think?
I don't want to steal Matt's area here because he'll cover some of this later on, but I guess preparing a functional requirements document is the starting point, and selecting the vendors, managing the vendor selection process and all the communications between all of those vendors, having a robust approach towards how you're going to score the selection process, and it's not all down to one person's decision and you're spreading that decision-making criteria. What is the selection criteria based on, whether it's cost, functionality, whether or not you feel there's a good connection culturally with the company that you want to work with. Now, understanding the trials and tribulations of working with each of the product and the vendor is absolutely critical, so that it's a right fit for your industry and, more importantly, your business. Are you really knowledgeable enough to challenge those vendors on your pains? And if you are, that's great. If not, then clearly working with a consultancy would give you an advantage. I'm confident that Matt will tell you that you'll need to spend a long time with these vendors, visit them, do your due diligence, go and visit existing customers of your potential providers. What is it really like working with that vendor? And what, more importantly, I guess, is the aftercare experience like? That's so important. And what people don't consider is, once your project's live, what then when things go wrong? And I think, again, Matt will be covering competing projects later on in the discussion, but always be mindful that time and budget will be in competition with other departments and projects for sure.
Of course, and then that sort of leads to the question whether or not this is an HR project or an IT project, because of course you're buying the system for the organization, not just your department. So you mentioned earlier as well, Malk, the art of the possible, and to me that sounds really quite exciting, but we've got the challenge as well of understanding our pain points and potentially not being blown away by smoke and mirrors. So can you talk a bit more about the art of the possible and industry standards?
Sure, yeah, and it's quite a deep subject, and people can follow up after this webinar, but many clients believe that they need to build the as-is system or lift and shift old processes into a new system and just simply replicate existing business process management as opposed to adopting industry best practices. This approach is neither helpful and it doesn't really allow the client to understand what is best practice or what industry standard may look like, or even end up over configuring a system to simply create the old world in the new system. And that's very time consuming and costly when some out of the box or low config options can really be achieved off the shelf with many new systems. So in simple terms, don't replicate your old system into the new. What's the point? And let the experts guide you on what good looks like in terms of industry best practice. Because if that functionality already exists in some systems, that means you're spending less time on consultancy configuring a system to do something it doesn't do out of the box. So yeah,
it's almost a point of understanding your process, what you want to achieve from the system, and marrying the two to make sure that you get the best from your new purchase. And there's going to be areas where potentially you might have to adjust, but then areas where you want to meet the system, but the system to meet your requirements as well. So an interesting metric is that apparently 65% of software projects run over budget and over time. What do you think affects that, Malk? Why would it be such a high figure?
I probably believe it's higher, but that's the feedback I get as well, is
Yep.
65%. It's probably because the scope of work and knowledge of the pitfalls where out of scope issues crop up. It's key to accurate budgeting and project delivery, making sure that your project's delivered on time. And I think working with a consultancy that knows the industry, knows where you can burn time and give you an accurate forecast for you to budget against and build in those buffers where you know there may be slippage, gives you more comfort that the consultancy knows what they're talking about, rather than hitting a bend in the curve later down the line where you end up with unexpected costs. When it comes to budget planning, it's really important to consider the total expense in terms of having a sound business case for that change in the first place. So, understand what the efficiencies gained would equate to, for example. I'm sure Matt will cover budget in more detail later in the conversation, but don't underestimate the time investment. It's not just about the hard costs of the software, it's the impact on the business too, and the disruption and investment of time that really needs to get this right.
Thanks, Malk. So Matt, let's move on to you. You've obviously got a wealth of experience in this area as well. What are the key things that you think clients should be considering, and how would you approach some of the issues that we've already discussed?
Yeah, I think to begin with, don't be too critical on yourself. Both yourself and Mark have touched on this. The HR tech landscape is so vast at the moment. If you were to go to any exhibition, you would be greeted with hundreds of different vendors, all that have their own specialties. Accept that the market is this vast and it's going to be overwhelming, especially when it comes to things like jargon or being guided on what the vendors think that you want to see. As somebody that works in HR, payroll, finance, that sort of thing, you're probably only going to go through this process about 4 to 5 times in your entire career. Based on that limited experience, how can you be expected to know everything about what is an ever-changing market? And that's not your fault. I think it's worthwhile engaging with a specialist that knows the market to be able to give you that additional support on how to navigate the technology industry. I think the second thing that I see quite a lot of is people underestimate the size and cost of what a selection project entails. And for me, a selection project is a project within its own right. Malk mentioned some really good points earlier on, like resource and budget. And I think understanding that selection project is going to have costs attached to it, but then also accepting that it's necessary for you to do this to select the best product for you as an organization. So many times we've seen people fall into the trap of going for something that they've used before in a previous organization, or making their decision based on a vanilla out of the box demonstration with no real understanding of how that products actually going to work in their organization. They may have changed verticals, they may work in a completely different sector before. Not all systems translate from one sector to another. So I think, you know, having that tailored approach and really having a detailed selection project is going to help you at least have the confidence that you're selecting the right system. I suppose if we first of all look at the resource aspect, a project team is going to need to be established to support throughout the selection and the implementation project. That project team is almost split into two. Firstly, you'll need a core project team of sponsors, perhaps the budget holder or the ultimate decision-making panel, and then the extended project team that will have key subject matter experts throughout, and that will potentially dip in and out depending on their expertise. So recruitment might not be involved in the whole process. They might only be involved in the parts that are relevant to them. Having that project team established and, you know, consistently involved throughout the project is going to be key. Consistency is so important, and having them involved in the discovery aspect and the documentation of their functional requirements, then involved in things like product demonstrations and the scoring of vendor responses or bids, is going to be key so that the business has a true holistic understanding of whether a solution can meet all of those requirements. I think, to give a very broad estimation of numbers, you're potentially talking anywhere from 6 to 8 people that are out of the business working on this project. I would say nearly full time, and you're looking at potentially 3 to 6 months for the selection and then 9 to 12 months for the implementation. So it is a considerable amount of time.
It's a huge project, isn't it? And you know, you've got, even before the implementation project, you've got the selection project, and even before that, as we've said previously, it's whether or not you actually need to go down this route. But I think what's interesting, just to sort of pull out from that, Matt, is about being grounded in your organization, knowing where you're at and what your requirements are going to be. And it's interesting to hear you say about how many people are going to be involved in this, because of course there's going to be a project board, you're likely to need project managers, the actual doers, your testers, you know, at the end of this. So lots of people involved. And you mentioned, Matt, on average 6 to 8. It sounds a lot. Can you sort of explain that in a bit more detail for us?
Yeah, and I think, not to backtrack on what I've said, but I think it comes with a caveat. If you're an organization of sub 500 employees that doesn't have a team that big, then obviously you're not going to be able to have that amount of people. I think to formulate your project team, you need to consider a few things. And if I give an example of potentially 2 people in HR doing the whole selection project and then implementing the solution, Mark alluded to this earlier, but what if they leave the business? You're not going to have any more knowledge of why the system was chosen, why it was implemented. You know, do those 2 people in HR, as knowledgeable as they might be, do they have the necessary understanding of the full organization and not just their department? Are they selecting based on what they personally want, or are they selecting based on what the needs of the business are? There's potentially more chance for bias with such a limited project team. You know, are they going to buy on what they know, what they're comfortable with, rather than evaluating more vendors that might potentially give them more functionality or a better functionality and cultural fit? I think more people is going to give a wider insight into what the business needs overall. And I know that there's the saying, too many cooks spoil the broth, but I don't necessarily agree with that statement when it comes to your HRIS. I think having knowledge from different departments is going to help you design a better system that's going to be more fit for purpose. Louise, you mentioned this earlier. Don't just design a HR system for just HR. You know, if we look at the different types of people that this might affect, yes, you've got HR, yes, you've got payroll, but then there's IT, there's the operational side of things, there's managers, employees, finance, health and safety. You know, the list could go on. As HR, you're potentially only designing the system for less than 1% of the organization, and that's not going to give you best fit. overall.
That's a really good point. Malc, have you got anything to add to that on the resourcing side?
Yeah, I completely agree with Matt and everything that he said, and we can't stress enough. I'd probably add that, you're selecting for the business and not just HR, as Matt said, but the
Yeah.
wider business really has to have a consideration in all this. All the people need to be fully considered in terms of impact assessment, and what's the digital strategy that your IT team want. Is that going to be cloud or on premise? You won't want to get to the point of selection and find out that your IT team won't allow your chosen product because it's on a prem solution rather than a cloud solution if everything they're doing is a cloud-based direction. So work closely with all the teams involved, and the more people involved, the better. And that will support them with change management and digital adoption rates as well. Ultimately, the more people that adopt and adapt to your new way of working, the more results you will get from the efficiencies gained from the system that you've selected.
Great, thanks, Malc. And I think it's unfortunately an area that lots of organisations do get wrong when it comes to resourcing, as you are going to have so many different stakeholders. So crucial that you think about that. Let's move on then to requirements gathering. Matt, can you tell us a bit more about how we go about knowing what we want from our system? So again, I think I said this earlier, we hear quite often people saying, I just don't like the system that I've got, or we need a new system. And we've established that it's a big undertaking to go on a selection project. So can you talk to us more about how to gather those requirements of what we might want from our tech?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the phrase that I don't like this system comes up quite a lot, but
Mm,
I am going to stick up for the vendors here, as I do feel like sometimes they're on the end of unfair criticism. In my opinion, and look, this is just one man's opinion, but I don't think there is a bad HR system out there. There are just systems and vendors that aren't right for you as an organization. And I think that's a key point. Whether it's functionally, whether it's culturally, or whether you've had a bad experience, I'm not taking away from that. But for some organizations, that particular vendor might be the perfect vendor. It might be the best thing since sliced bread for them, So I think that's really something to consider. I think in terms of knowing what you want, Malc's mentioned this before, but understanding what your problems are within either the system setup or your processes. My approach, or phase 3 approach, is to requirement gathering is that similar to a business process review exercise. By talking through and documenting all of your processes end to end in as much detail as possible, I think that's going to give you that holistic overview of what you as an organization needs. It's going to help you truly understand the current state of play, and will highlight any potential risks, problems, or even just general areas of improvement. I think it's also worthwhile focusing on things that are working well. One thing that we don't want to lose as part of this process is practices that you have in place, or functionality that does actually work, and that I'll go as far as saying, enjoy using that particular bit of functionality. Using what you've documented will then help you to understand what you want to achieve. Are you looking to get as much automation as possible? Do you want to get rid of all the manual processes, all those spreadsheets that you're currently tracking everything on? Once you've understood your strategy for the technology, then that's when you can really start to design your utopia processes, and therefore your requirements. For example, do you need a mobile app because your workforce is really diverse? Do you need that quick and easy access to perform tasks? I think the focus here is to go into as much detail as possible, and go as granular as you possibly can without putting you off. Typically, I would gather anywhere from 200 to 300 requirements per organization, and there have been some cases where it's been over 500. But they're typically for the more complex organizations with multiple entities or TUPEs or whatever that might be. Then once you've documented your requirements, the next step is you need to undertake the task of prioritizing what's most important to you. Are there any non-negotiables whereby if a solution doesn't meet those requirements, they're automatically qualified out? I would err on the side of caution here and only go for sort of a maximum of 10 non-negotiables. What you don't want to end up in a position is where you've qualified every supplier out of the process because those 10 requirements are so specific. The rest should then be graded on a level of importance, from ones that you absolutely can't live without to ones that are nice to haves, and then ones that, do you know what, if it comes in the future or doesn't happen, we can live without them. Typically, we use a Moscow rating, so you must have, should have, could haves, but there are other alternative scoring methods out there. Once you've documented and then graded all of your requirements, that's when you've finally got your requirement specification. And this is going to be key to challenging vendors on what you're trying to achieve, and can be used as that functional document that you can then take to market.
A couple of things there. I think that the first one that I picked up on quite quickly was when you spoke about manual processes and spreadsheets. That ties into everything that we've been saying about understanding where you're at as an organization and not being too hard on yourself either. We still see lots of spreadsheets, lots of manual processes. And this is the opportune time when you've been talking about how you go through requirements gathering, it's a good time to start cutting out waste as well. So not just getting away from manual processes, but understanding where there's duplication too. And that then starts to link into the piece around getting the best from a new product. Because again, people can be quite set in their ways. You've identified that you need a new system or that you would like a new system, but it might be that somebody else in the department has got so embedded in their ways of manual processes. If you're not marrying the system to your process and your process to that system, you'll end up replicating the old in the new and not getting the best. That's how it all starts to come together in one piece. And I particularly like what you said there, Matt, around your 10 non-negotiables. That's probably going to be quite an interesting one as to what those 10 are. And I imagine that they're very different, again, depending on what type of organization you work for. So we've now got all of the right people in the right place, but I do want to dig a little bit deeper again on budget and timescales, because of course in this economic climate, and there's probably organisations on the call such as third sector, charity. So what do you think are the key takeaways for budget and timescales?
Yeah, I think firstly for me, budget's twofold. I think everybody focuses on the implementation budget. What's it going to cost me to actually get this system live? But as with the resource element of a selection project, I often feel that the budget for a selection project is overlooked. And I think whether you use a specialist, expert, or consultancy or not, consider the time that it's going to take to manage that selection project and that resource required. I mentioned 6 to 8 people. That's potentially 6 to 8 people that you're going to have to backfill, not only for the implementation, but for that selection project. And then people often think, well, that's a lot of money. Why am I spending so much time when I've not even implemented that solution? Well, is it better to spend a little bit more on your selection project to ensure that you've got the processes in place, that you have the project team to support your decision making, and that you are confident that whatever provider you've chosen is the best provider that's going for you going forward? I'd be confident in saying that it's more costly to not invest in the selection project and get it wrong and then have to move systems 3 years down the line than it is to spend that extra time putting time and effort into your selection project. By using an expert, I think it will support in your decision making, but also utilizing their experience, it can help you set expectations from a very, very early stage. Part of what I do, even prior to discovery stage, is set the expectations of what the average solution will cost, both from an annual license fee, but also from throughout the implementation process. And we would do a resource analysis that would say you're going to need X number of people on this project full time based on what you need. This is what it would cost you to backfill them. I personally feel like having that information early on in your selection process allows you to be able to inform the necessary people, what it's going to cost, how it will affect the business, and then by working with those specialists, it will help you to understand the potential for your return on investment, so that you can demonstrate that to the budget holders and get more buy-in to be able to say, yes, we can spend this money because it's going to achieve X, Y, and Z. I think to touch on the timescales piece, I very briefly, touched on this earlier on. And so many times we've spoken with organizations that have made the decision that they want to move, but they want a new system, they want it yesterday. I've previously given high-level timelines, but realistically, depending on complexities and size of organization, you could be looking for a configured implementation anywhere between sort of and the selection piece, anywhere from 12 to 18 months at a minimum.
12 to 18 months is a really long time. Again, it can seem quite daunting. Why is it so long?
I think, look, firstly, some organisations may have the knowledge and capacity to deliver some elements involved in the selection and the implementation in-house, and that's absolutely fine. Or as Mark's alluded to, you might not be at the stage where a full selection project is even required. But if I briefly talk you through an end-to-end selection project similar to the one that I carry out on a daily basis for organisations. So if we talk about firstly the requirement gathering, let's assume that we've taken the time to get the project team in place. If we talk about the selection process, so firstly you've got your requirement gathering. Now, to truly understand every process that has an employee or system touch point is going to be intense. Typically for HR and payroll, we would always estimate anywhere between 4 to 5 days of discovery just to gather those requirements. That's not taking into account if you want to bring in things like workforce management, finance, recruitment. Once you've then agreed your requirements, you've then got the actual selection project. So you might do that in the form of a request for proposal, an invitation to tender, or some form of market engagement exercise. If you've got a detailed requirement specification that you need suppliers to take the time to review and respond to, you're going to need them to allow them a few weeks to even formulate a response. And then you've got your demonstrations, whether that's 1 or 2 rounds of demonstration. If you're doing scenario-based or practical demonstrations, they in themselves can take at least half a day. So that is added timescales onto that. So let's say discovery is 3 or 4 weeks. Then you've got the market engagement exercise and the demonstrations at potentially 6 weeks. Let's say you're quite prompt in then making your decision on what supplier is your preferred supplier. You've then got the contract negotiation. There's always going to be some back and forth, reviewing the documents. That in itself is how we get to 3 to 6 months, depending on how many different steps are involved in that process. Then if you move into the implementation side of things, you're going to have the design stage. Now, what I will say is if you spend time designing your processes ahead of time in the selection process, you've already got those processes mapped out, so it can save time in the design. And I know from experience of speaking to vendors, they love it if you come to them with process maps or an idea of what you already want to build. It makes their life a heck of a lot easier. But then once we get into the implementation, you've got the build stage and then user acceptance testing, which could be anywhere from 2 to 3 months. And then on top of that, you've got your parallel runs. And there may be some vendors that disagree here, but I wouldn't do anything less than 2 parallel runs in an organization, and in some cases 3, depending on the level of complexities. So just for parallel runs and UAT, that in itself could be 6 months before, and you've not even considered the design stage at the beginning. Now, what I will say is there are solutions out there that can do out-of-the-box implementations, and I think it's about assessing what is right for you as an organization. If you are, and I'll touch on this later on, but if you're a complex organization with some established processes, you're going to need a highly configurable, customizable solution that can do anything and everything. There's naturally going to be a higher cost to implement and maintain than an out-of-the-box, more simple solution.
Sure. So I think what we're saying is that it is such a big investment, not just in terms of budget and resourcing, and the fact it encompasses the entire organization, to therefore rush through an implementation is only going to cause further issues later on. So it's much better to go with a full plan, and if it's 12 to 18 months, then so be it. But at the end of that, by following these processes that we're discussing, you should have something that works well. So most people on the call today are from HR backgrounds, like myself. And as you mentioned earlier, Matt, we don't go through this too many times in our HR careers. So specifically looking at, HR teams, HR managers or HR directors, what are the expectations on those specific roles?
Yeah, and I think firstly, it's the openness to change. As Mark mentioned earlier, we see so many people lifting current processes into a new system. And without sounding, too direct, I've never been or worked with an organization that's not had some areas where they could have cut waste or improved. So we would always try to avoid lifting your current processes directly into a HR system. But it's so common as people try to hold on to something familiar. In let's face it, it is a massive change. Throughout discovery as consultants, we will challenge your current ways of working, and this is natural. I think from my experience, a lot of people do feel judged when we challenge. It's as though they've done something wrong, and this absolutely isn't the case. I think the reason why you challenge those ways of working is to deepen your knowledge of the organization and what's going on. But I think also it helps in identifying areas where you can drive automation. And let's be honest, automation is probably one of the largest ways to maximize your return on investment. It is all about bettering the way we work. And let's be honest, as HR, payroll, finance professionals, we don't spend years of studying or years of practicing what we do to become administrators. Therefore, if we can automate as much as possible of the administration as possible, those people can spend more time doing more value added work and add to the real strategic goals of the organization. I think in terms of impact throughout the selection, while specialists can absolutely help you with most of the heavy lifting, there's also going to be a reliance on yourselves as an organization. These processes are intense, they are time consuming, and let's be honest, people can think of better things to do than spending their time in workshops discussing systems and processes. It's not the most exciting prospect. I get it, but it is necessary, and one that in the long run will save time and money. The more we can get out of those workshops, the better. Doing that detailed discovery and getting those process maps ahead of time will absolutely save time and money. And as I said before, throughout implementation, the vendors are going to love how prepared you are. I think there's also an impact in terms of supporting on functional documentation. Whilst, as consultants, we can provide best practice evaluation sheets, scoring methodology, having the impact from the team on what's most important to you as an organization. Is it price? Is it service? Is it functionality? Is it, what's on the roadmap for the next 2 to 3 years? We can make estimates based on our experience, but having your input on that and the demonstration scoring is going to be key to delivering a successful project. And I think the longer lasting impact is realizing that a piece of technology is an ongoing project. You don't just go live and then put your feet up, so to speak. It's like a car. It needs love and attention. You wouldn't have a car and not give it oil, not change the wheels, not take it for an MOT or service. A piece of technology is the exact same. Best practice indicates that you should be conducting a yearly health check. You should be looking at areas of improvement and never staying stagnant. I think that is probably one of the largest pieces to take away from this is once you're live, that dedicated resource to manage and develop the system and processes going forward is going to mean that you're not conducting this process as often.
Absolutely, and it's an important point that systems do require maintenance. They are needy, just in the same way that you would update your iPhone. I had to update my smart TV. You've got to make sure that your systems are maintained and looked after. So we've said a couple of times about lifting current processes into the new system. We try to avoid that. But given that there are much larger, configurable, customizable systems, and then your smaller ones. And we know that this type of project is going to be dependent on the type of organization that, of course, you are. We do hear this phrase knocking about quite a lot, which is lift and shift. Malk, do you have any sort of opinions? Because it sounds nice and easy, and again, depending on the size of your organization, or that sounds potentially a bit of an easier a project to lift and shift. Can you talk us through your experience of that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, how long's a piece of string? I guess it depends on many factors, Louise. What's the source system? What's the data format? What workflows are there? What integrations are there? There's so much to consider. And I think dumbing this down, it's a whole subject in its own right. Okay, so we can cover that in a consultancy experience later. But a big bang approach can be what I would deem significantly overwhelming and lead to project failure.
Okay.
So maybe just start considering ahead of your project how you can carve up those mini data projects into smaller chunks so that you've got a more agile rollout, and that's a smoother transition maybe. Integrations will be a key consideration for you. How many do you have now? How many would you need in future in your new system? Is it any additional integrations and workflows that need creating, for example? Lift and shift, despite what a vendor tells you, will not be as easy and seamless as they might have you believe. Trust me. This is software we're talking about, right?
Yeah. And that's good advice. Thanks, Malk. But so often we hear customers say, and I actually sometimes say this myself in other areas, you just want something that works. So if a customer comes to you and uses that precise phrase, what would you say? I just want HR tech that works.
Listen, I'm Mark, I'll pick up on this one. I understand your frustrations, and there's nothing more annoying than having a piece of software that just isn't working. As we've said before, moving system won't necessarily solve all of your problems. I think identifying that root cause and understanding, is that the reason why we are moving, or can it be fixed? What is the root cause? Is it down to inefficient processes? Is there reluctance to move away from spreadsheets, or is it genuinely that there is a functionality issue? If it's the latter, then obviously that could be achieved by moving system. But if it's not, is it better to spend the time sorting your processes out rather than moving system? Finding something that works isn't just down to the vendor making it work for you. It's down to you as an organization to make sure that you are in the best possible the best place possible, and not just doing that lift and shift as Mark's mentioned. If you do that, then it may mean that those issues just transfer to a new solution.
So what about out of the box functionality then? Some organizations after selection do say we just want something out of the box. And again, that sounds quite nice. But what if you're a particularly complicated business? Would out of the box work for that?
I mean, potentially, yes. More and more vendors are coming up with, specific industry builds where they will tell you what best practice from their experience in the industry is. And that absolutely could work. I think out of the box is an interesting one. I work with a lot of organizations that historically have built so many workarounds to achieve their system goals. And then because of all these workarounds, they're put off by configuring a system in the future, and they want that vanilla out of the box system. And I think this is where you need to be specific in what you're wanting and what you're trying to achieve. Do you want your requirements to be met by something that somebody else is telling you will meet them, or do you want to spend that time configuring functionality that's going to mean that your processes will actually work? And I think there's a bit of connection here. There is absolutely what you want your processes to be, but there's absolutely what the vendor can say best practice will be. I think in my experience, out of the box solutions tend to work with smaller, less complex organizations, or those that are perhaps getting their first HR or payroll solution. Personally, I feel like as an organization with established ways of working, an out of the box solution more often than not won't meet the requirements that you have, especially if you've got complex requirements. By taking that out of the box solution, you may end up with additional costs later down the line, or it might be that you fall out of love with that system quite quickly and end up in the same place 3 years down the line where you want to move system.
So it's really that marriage between the system to your process and your process to the system, triangulating that. So I think one of the more exciting parts about the system selection process is, of course, going to be the demo, because that's when we've obviously gathered our requirements, we've started to reach out to vendors, and now we're going to see some of the art of the possible, as we mentioned earlier. Have you both got some advice on how to handle the demo process, please?
Sure, yeah. I'm glad you find demos exciting, Louise. But
I
do. Pardon me. I guess you need to know what the problem is you're trying to solve, right?
Mm-hmm.
Scenario-based demos really challenge them. Don't let vendors rock up and throw up a vanilla walkthrough of a vanilla functionality and walk through how to create a record or look at some pretty dashboards. Make sure the demo is real-life, role-based scenarios that you find painful in your existing system. Do not be afraid to be non-technical, but ask those dumb questions. It's okay. Be confident with that, and ask what differentiates that vendor from other vendors in the software. And then you can challenge the other vendors in the demo process on those particular points, for example. It's a place to really learn something new. So work with your IT team, work with your consultancy to guide you here on what the scenarios and scripts should really look like, and avoid the standard demo pitch at all costs. Matt, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And the scenario-based demonstrations are the first demonstrations that I would always expose my my customers to. What I would say is go a little bit further. The scenario-based is great, but then ask the vendors to come do a practical demonstration on site. You have the ability to go to a vendor's site, as you've mentioned before, Mal, or for them to come to visit you. Get them to bring iPads, get them to bring other devices so that you can see how each bit of the process is going to work on various different devices or ways of working. I think doing that practical demonstration is going to be that step further to really understanding how users are going to be or what they're going to be exposed to on a regular basis. And at this stage, I would probably invite more people than just your core project team. Get some managers, get some end users, because if they have that chance to play around in the system, they're going to then be champions for the system going forward. And when you implement that system, you're already going to have a team of people that have seen it and felt it and can be like, yeah, that system's great. It was so easy to use. It's going to save me so much time doing X, Y, and Z. And that can support with all of your adoption rates.
And what I'm hearing straight away is you've both used plurals: visits, demos, the team. So it's not just the one demo. How many demos might you end up having then, Matt? Would it be
typically in an end-to-end selection process for what I would conduct? It would be 2. It would be that scenario-based one with the core project team, and then a practical-based with the wider managers and everything. I think you could be at danger if you went with 3 or 4 at been death by demo, and nobody wants that, and it's also really time consuming.
Mm.
I wouldn't recommend any more than 2, but if you absolutely need to and you can't decide between which vendor, 3 at an absolute maximum.
Okay, thanks, Matt. And I think just drawing back again full circle to the fact that once you have made your selection, you'll be working together with your vendor or your consultancy for a long time. So it's important to build those relationships, do your visits, and ask for references as well. That's crucial to gain references from an organization that might be very mature in their system journey with that particular vendor, see how they've found the whole experience. And then an organization that might be still going through implementation, a reference there would be really interesting as well. But of course, one that's of a similar scale to your organization, that would be a good piece of advice there as well. So I'm conscious of the time. We've spoken for 50 minutes on the HR tech market. I think we could probably do hours and hours on this. So I'm going to open up for questions to come through. And just while people are starting to put their questions in the chat there, we have, of course, covered a high number of examples, pieces of advice, and different areas that are going to be key considerations. So what I would do is advise people to go on the Phase 3 website or to email us at info@phase3.co.uk, mentioning that you've attended today's webinar, so that you can get in touch directly with either myself, Matt, or Malk for some further advice or guidance. So just in terms of questions, I have got one which is I'm about to replace my HR system, but I already know that there won't be a budget for a project team. We're going to be delivering this on top of BAU. What advice do you have? And that's to you both, Malk and Matt, for this person about to embark on their project.
If I pick that up first, Mark, I think obviously I've spent a lot of time talking about the resource required, and that's absolutely fine if and actually it's more common than you think of people not getting the budget. I think factor that into any implementation plan. Obviously vendors will provide you with their best practice, but if you explain the fact that this is going to be on top of BAU, they may allow for more time to support with that implementation of the new system. I think that then also needs to be a cut-off point. So, whilst they're working on BAU or answering all these questions about the system, there then needs to be a cut-off point that says, okay, we're now not going to do any more work on the existing system until a point that we're implementing the new system, and that's when we'll start picking up the development questions again.
For me, I'm just shaking my head a little bit, if I'm honest, Louise. I think if you can't invest the time to get this right, the cost impact and the disruption isn't worth it, and I just wouldn't do it at all. But I think the cost of inaction for a business and not changing if they need to, and the cost of delay is immense as well. So it's a fine balance, if I'm honest, Louise. It's whether you soldier on and try and fit it into BAU or just delay it completely. And I think it's a really hard one to call, if I'm honest. And I've seen so many times, and I hear from organizations and people that work in the organizations I've worked with, and even at Phase 3 sometimes, the reason for project delay 9 times out of 10 is not the vendor or the consultancy, it's the client, and it's client resource that's dragging it down. And it's so depressing that everyone else is just at the mercy of availability of people, and it hasn't been thought through properly. And that's where you can really make a difference. Is if you're going to commit, commit with both feet is my only advice.
Thanks, Malc. And I think from my point of view, there are options out there as well. I completely agree with both Malc and Matt, but there are options in terms of using consultancies, asking the vendor, if they have extra resource to place on this. You could look at the project as a whole, and seeing where you might be able to utilize a third party, for example. And we of course offer a tailored approach. So if it was that you could only have, I don't know, a couple of days a month, although you'd have to be very realistic in terms of what can be achieved in those small amounts of time. There are consultancies out there, and of course, Phase 3 can help you with that. With a high caliber consultant, you can actually achieve more than you might on your own. So I don't think there's any more questions that have come through. So we will wrap that up there. And it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you both, Malc and Matt. Thank you for your time. And thank you for the time for everybody else that's joined us this morning. As I say, there is a wealth of material available on the Phase 3 website, www.phase3.co.uk, or reach out to info@phase3.co.uk, and we'll be sure to get back to you, and we look forward to hopefully working with you soon. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a fantastic Wednesday, and we'll see you soon. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.